They say a house built on sand cannot stand. Mine was a castle, 20 years in the making, with walls I believed were stone and foundations I thought were unshakable. I never saw the tide coming in until the night it swept everything away. But what they don't tell you is what you find after the storm, after the wreckage has been cleared, and you're left alone on the shore. That's where you find yourself. This isn't the story of how my marriage ended. It is the story of how my life truly began. I always believed our story was built on solid ground. 20 years of a quiet love, of comfortable routines, and a future that seemed as certain as the sunrise. We weren't a romance novel. We were something I thought was better. Real. We were the easy silence on a Sunday morning, the shared glance across a crowded room, the familiar weight of his hand on my back. Our life was a well-worn path, and I walked it with a sense of peaceful certainty. But what I thought was bedrock was actually sand. And the tide came rushing in on a random Tuesday night, in the form of a single, silent notification that lit up his phone, left carelessly on the nightstand. That soft blue glow in the darkness wasn't just a light, it was a fire alarm in my soul. He was asleep, a soft, rhythmic breathing that I had timed my own to for 2 decades. The house was still, wrapped in the deep, velvet quiet of 2 a.m. But in my chest, a drum began to beat, a frantic, primal rhythm of dread. My own mind became a battlefield. One voice, the one of the wife I had been for 20 years, whispered, "Don't. It's nothing. You're being paranoid. Trust him." But another voice, one I hadn't heard in years, a raw, instinctual part of me, screamed back, "You have to know. Something is wrong. You've felt it for months." The feeling, it hadn't been a sudden storm, but a slow change in the climate of our home. A subtle cooling, conversations that skimmed the surface, never diving deep. A new password on his laptop, explained away as a work requirement. The way he'd started angling his phone away from me, a barely perceptible shift that I had meticulously cataloged and then dismissed as my own insecurity. Every dismissed doubt, every ignored gut feeling, came rushing back to me in that dark room, illuminated by that single pulsing light. My hand trembled as I reached for it. The phone felt unnaturally cold, heavy, like an artifact from a ruin. My heart was a wild bird trapped in my ribs. I touched the screen. It wasn't locked. An open door to an abyss. And I jumped. It wasn't just one message. It was a thread, a novel, a secret history of the last 2 years of his life. A life I had no part in. The name at the top wasn't one I recognized. The words below were daggers. "Can't wait to see you. Last night was incredible. I love the way you look at me." And then, the pictures. Selfies of a woman I didn't know, and then pictures of them together, at a restaurant we used to go to, on a beach I'd always wanted to visit. Her head on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her, wearing the very sweater I'd bought him for his last birthday. Every word, every image was a physical blow. It wasn't a sharp pain, it was a slow-acting poison that paralyzed every cell in my body. The air left my lungs. The room began to spin, the shadows on the wall twisting into monstrous shapes. I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone clutched in my hand, reading the chronicle of a love that wasn't ours. I scrolled up, and up, and up, a desperate archaeologist digging through my own destruction. I saw my own life referenced in their texts. "Have to go. She's almost home. Anniversary dinner tonight. Wish it was with you." The man sleeping beside me, the one whose snores were the soundtrack to my life, was a stranger. A ghost, and worse. The woman I saw in the mirror every morning, she was a fool. Who was I, if not the other half of this lie? The foundation of my identity, my role as a wife, a partner, a confidant, crumbled into dust. 20 years. 20 years of memories were now tainted, rewritten in the blue light of this screen. Our wedding photo on the dresser seemed to mock me. The life we had built was a house of cards, and I had just pulled out the bottom one. I sat there until the first hint of dawn colored the sky, the phone screen dark. My world completely, irrevocably shattered. The confrontation wasn't the screaming match you see in movies. There was no throwing of plates, no dramatic accusations shouted across a room. It was worse. It was quiet. devastatingly quiet. I waited until the sun was fully up, until the smell of brewing coffee filled the kitchen, a routine so normal it felt like a cruel joke. He came downstairs, smiling, and asked if I'd slept well. The question hung in the air between us, so absurd, so completely disconnected from the reality I now inhabited. I just looked at him and slid the phone across the granite countertop. The change in his face is something I will never forget. The slow draining of color, the flicker of panic in his eyes, the way his smile dissolved. Then came the denials. The weak, pathetic litany of lies. It's not what you think. She's just a friend. It was a mistake. Each word was an insult to my intelligence, another shovel of dirt on the grave of our marriage. I didn't argue. I just listened, and with every hollow excuse, a cold, hard clarity settled over me. The nauseating realization was that the affair wasn't the end, it was a symptom of a marriage that had already flatlined, and I was the only one who hadn't noticed the patient was dead. The silence, the distance, the secrets, they weren't new. They had been growing in the dark for years. He hadn't just cheated on me, he had checked out of our life a long, long time ago. He had been living a double life, and I had been the perfect, oblivious co-star in his play. The decision to leave wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of survival. It was the moment when, standing in the rubble of my life, I chose myself. I looked at this man, this stranger, and I saw my future. A future of suspicion, of hollow apologies, of walking on eggshells, of wondering every time his phone buzzed. And I said no. I walked upstairs, pulled a single suitcase from the top of the closet, and began to pack. Not with rage, but with a strange, surgical detachment. A few clothes. My toothbrush. The worn paperback I was reading. I didn't take the photos. I didn't take the mementos. I was leaving the set, and I couldn't take the props with me. Walking out of that house felt like tearing off my own skin. I was leaving behind not just a husband, but an entire future I had meticulously mapped out. The retirement we planned, the grandchildren we'd hoped for. It all vanished as I closed the front door behind me, the click of the lock echoing like a gunshot. Divorce isn't just signing a piece of paper, it's a death. It's the grief for a life that no longer exists, and you have to attend the funeral every single day. The first few months were a journey through a vast, empty desert. I moved into a small, sterile apartment that smelled of fresh paint and someone else's memories. The silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered me. I would wake up in the middle of the night reaching for him, my hand finding only cold, empty sheets. For the first time in 20 years, I had to learn to sleep alone, to occupy the center of the bed, a territory that felt frighteningly vast. Everything was a painful reminder. The grocery store, where I'd walk down the aisle and instinctively reach for his favorite brand of cereal before my hand would freeze in midair. A song on the radio that was, our song. Dividing our friends was like a brutal custody battle, hushed phone calls and awkward allegiances. And then there were the memories, which we had to divide like assets. Who gets to keep the memory of that trip to Maine? Who gets the story of how we first met? The bureaucracy of it all was a special kind of hell. Sitting in sterile lawyers' offices, discussing the division of our life in terms of finances and property. Our shared history, our love, reduced to a spreadsheet. It was cold and it was clinical, and it stripped away any last shred of dignity. But the hardest war was the one I fought against myself, against the inner critic that had taken up permanent residence in my head. Its voice was relentless, a constant, cruel whisper. You were a fool. How could you not have known? You failed. You weren't enough. You are unlovable. I would find myself on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, sobbing, not just for the loss of my husband, but for the loss of my own self-worth. I felt like a failure, a cliché, another woman discarded for a younger model. But even in the deepest, driest part of the desert, you can find an oasis. The rebuilding didn't happen with a grand gesture. It happened in the dust, brick by painful brick. It started with tiny, almost imperceptible pleasures. I bought a brand of expensive coffee he always said was a waste of money. I remember the first morning I made it, just for me. I sat by my new window, in my empty apartment, and I savored every single sip. It tasted like freedom. I started watching the shows he would have hated, sprawling period dramas and cheesy reality competitions, curled up on my own couch with my own blanket, no one there to judge my choices. And then one day, watching a silly comedy, a laugh escaped me. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a deep, genuine, belly laugh. It caught me by surprise, and it sounded like a language I'd forgotten I knew. I sat there, in the silence after, and I smiled. It was the first crack of light in a long, dark night. This is where the shift happened. Everyone expected me to get back out there, to find a new man to fill the void. But the thought was repulsive. The void wasn't husband-shaped. The void was me-shaped. I had spent so long being one half of a whole that I had forgotten what it felt like to be a complete person on my own. So I started dating myself. It was awkward at first. I began asking myself questions I hadn't considered in years. What do want for dinner? What movie do want to see? Who am Quas without his last name? Without the title of wife? I took myself out to dinner, sat at a table for one with a book, and refused to feel self-conscious. I went to museums and spent hours in front of a single painting, with no one rushing me along. And then, I bought paints. I hadn't painted since before I was married, a passion I'd shelved years ago because it was messy, and it took up too much time. And it just faded away. I remember standing in the art supply store, the smell of turpentine and canvas filling my lungs. It felt like coming home. My first painting was terrible. A messy, abstract explosion of color. But it was mine. Every brushstroke was a reclamation of a part of myself I had given away. I took that trip to Italy, the one he always called frivolous. I went alone. I walked the ancient streets of Rome, ate gelato in a sun-drenched piazza in Florence, and sat on the coast of Cinque Terre, watching the waves crash against the rocks. I remember one specific afternoon, sitting at a tiny cafe, sketching the scene in a small notebook, a glass of wine in my hand. I felt a sense of peace, so profound it brought tears to my eyes. It wasn't loneliness. It was solitude. A beautiful, powerful, chosen solitude. I was not waiting for anyone. I was not missing anyone. I was simply there. And I was enough. I started calling the friends my marriage had pushed to the back burner. The ones who knew me before I was a we. There were awkward apologies, explanations, but mostly, there was grace. An easy forgiveness. A coffee date turned into a 3-hour conversation, laughing about old times, talking about the future. I wasn't filling the space he left. I was discovering and claiming the space that had always, rightfully, been mine. Today, when I tell my story, the woman speaking is not the one who sat shivering in the dark, staring at a phone screen. The pain of his betrayal is no longer a gaping wound. The scars are there, yes, I see them. But they don't ache anymore. They are the map that led me here, to this version of myself. A version that is serene, self-possessed, and unshakably strong. I learned that strength isn't about never falling. It's about what you do when you hit the ground. It's about sitting in the rubble and deciding to build something new. Something better. Something that is entirely your own. I am no longer defined by the label of divorcee or the ghost of a failed marriage. I am a painter. A traveler. A friend. A woman who found her strength, not in spite of the fall, but because of it. This story isn't about the end of my marriage. It's about the beginning of my life. It's a testament that sometimes the happy ending isn't about finding Prince Charming. It's about walking away from the castle and realizing you were the queen all along. From the ashes of the woman I was, rose the woman I was always meant to be. Before you build a life with someone, you build a story. You gather the raw materials, a shared glance, a first date, a whispered secret, and you start laying the foundation. You tell yourself this story, over and over, until it becomes your truth. My story with him began on a crisp autumn afternoon, in a place that felt as solid and timeless as I believed our future would be. It was a small, independent bookstore, the kind that's sadly becoming a relic. The air inside was thick with the scent of aging paper, brewed coffee, and rain-soaked jackets. It was my sanctuary, a quiet corner of the world where I felt most like myself. I was tucked away in the history section, running my fingers along the spines of books, lost in my own world. And then, I felt it. That subtle shift in the air when you know you're being watched. Not in a creepy way, but in a way that feels intentional. I looked up, and there he was, standing at the end of the aisle. He wasn't movie star handsome, not in a way that would make heads turn on the street. It was something quieter, deeper. He had this incredible stillness about him, a calm that seemed to radiate from his very core. In a world that felt increasingly loud and chaotic, he was a pocket of silence. He was holding a book of poetry, which seemed so at odds with his sturdy, grounded appearance. He smiled, a slow, gentle curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes but settled comfortably on his face. And he said, "That's a good one. Her letters are even better." My first impression wasn't a lightning bolt. It was the feeling of finding a comfortable chair after a long day of walking. He was easy. The conversation flowed between us as if we'd been having it for years. He didn't try to impress me with grand stories or loud opinions. He just listened. He asked questions, real questions, about the books I loved, about the things I dreamed of, and he listened to the answers as if they were the most important words in the world. What drew me in wasn't a spark, it was a warmth, the feeling of being truly seen. In those early days, he was my anchor. He was the epitome of dependable. If he said he would call at 8, the phone would ring at 8:01. If my car broke down, he was there before the tow truck. He had a quiet competence that made me feel safe. He wasn't a man of grand romantic gestures. He didn't write me songs or fill my room with roses. His love language was in the practical, the tangible. It was in the way he'd make me a cup of tea without me asking when he saw I was stressed. It was the way he'd hold my hand while driving, his thumb stroking the back of mine, a simple, constant reassurance that he was there. He seemed to possess a kind of integrity I thought was unshakable, a moral compass that pointed true north. I didn't just fall in love with him. I put my faith in him. I remember one night, about 6 months after we met, we'd gone for a drive out of the city, chasing the sunset. We ended up on a deserted country road, parked on a hill overlooking the valley, as the sky bled from orange to deep indigo. The stars were just starting to appear, faint pinpricks in the velvet darkness. We weren't talking much, just listening to the crickets and the soft hum of the engine. He turned to me, and in the faint glow of the dashboard lights, his face was so earnest, so open. He said, "You know, before I met you, I felt like I was just collecting days, just getting through them. But with you, I feel like I'm building something that will last." He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his touch so gentle it was barely there. "I want to build a life with you," he said. And in that moment, under that vast, star-filled sky, I believed him with every cell in my body. I saw it all laid out before us. The house, the children, the shared Christmases and quiet anniversaries. A future built on the bedrock of his steadiness and my faith. That memory became my cornerstone. For 20 years, whenever I felt a tremor of doubt, I would return to that moment on that hill. It was my proof. It was the promise. It was the beginning of the story I told myself was true. A story of a house built on stone, destined to stand forever. That promise, made under a blanket of stars, wasn't a fleeting moment of romance. It was the blueprint. We spent the next year drawing the plans, not with paper and pencil, but with late-night conversations, shared meals, and the easy, comfortable rhythm of two lives braiding themselves into one. The question, when it came, was as quiet and certain as everything else about him. It was the second anniversary of the day we met in the bookstore. He suggested we go back, just to browse. The air was the same, that beloved mix of old paper and brewing coffee. We wandered the aisles, not saying much, just enjoying the comfortable silence we had perfected. He led me back to the history section, to the very spot where I first looked up and saw him. He handed me a book. It was a beautiful, leather-bound edition of the letters of the same author we had first talked about. I opened it, and my breath caught in my throat. Tied to the silk bookmark with a simple ribbon was a ring. It wasn't large or flashy. It was a simple, elegant band, timeless and understated. Perfect. I looked up at him, and his eyes held that same calm, steady gaze from our first meeting, but this time, it was filled with a question that held our entire future. He didn't get down on one knee. He didn't make a speech. He just whispered, "Will you build a life with me?" And in that quiet sanctuary, surrounded by a million other stories, I said yes to beginning ours. Our first few years of marriage felt like a time-lapse of a house being built. We bought a small, neglected bungalow with good bones and a wild, overgrown garden. That house became our shared project, our canvas. I remember the weekends spent, covered in dust and paint, laughing until our sides hurt. He was patient and methodical, teaching me how to spackle a wall, how to lay tile. I was the one with the vision, picking out colors, imagining where our future children might one day play. Our dreams were simple, tangible things. We wanted a home filled with warmth and the smell of baking bread. We planned to fill the garden with peonies and hydrangeas. We talked about traveling, not to fancy resorts, but to national parks where we could hike and sit by a fire. We weren't chasing wealth or status. We were building a life rich in experiences, in quiet moments in us. We were a team. We were laying every brick, every floorboard together. And I never once doubted the strength of our foundation. I truly believed we were building something that could withstand any storm. There were so many moments of happiness, but one stands out, a memory so clear and bright, it became the sun in the solar system of our marriage. It was our 5th anniversary. He surprised me with a trip to a tiny, secluded cabin in the mountains of Vermont in the dead of winter. A massive snowstorm hit the day after we arrived, burying us in a world of white. The power went out, the roads were impassable, we were completely, utterly cut off. And it was the most perfect week of my life. There was no television, no internet, no phones. Just us. A roaring fire in the stone fireplace, and the silent, heavy fall of snow outside the picture window. We spent our days reading side by side on the sofa, drinking wine and talking for hours. Not about bills or schedules, but about everything and nothing. We talked about our childhoods, our biggest fears, our most secret hopes. The outside world, with all its noise and demands, simply ceased to exist. I remember one night, we were bundled in blankets, watching the flames dance in the hearth. The only light in the room was the golden glow of the fire, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He was tracing patterns on the back of my hand, and I was leaning my head on his shoulder, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. He turned his head and looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw a love so pure, so absolute, it felt like the most profound truth in the universe. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. In that silent, fire-lit moment, I felt a certainty that settled deep in my bones. This was it. This was forever. This was real. That feeling, that absolute, unshakable faith in him, in us, that was the pinnacle. That was the memory I would cling to. The proof that our love was the realest thing I had ever known. They say a house built on sand cannot stand, but no one tells you that bedrock can erode. It doesn't happen with an earthquake. It happens slowly, with the constant, patient drip of water you don't even notice until the ground beneath your feet starts to feel hollow. Our pinnacle, that snowbound week in Vermont, felt like it had solidified our foundation forever, but looking back, I see it was the last moment of true stillness before the long, slow erosion began. The first crack wasn't a fight, it was a silence. He got a promotion at work a couple of years later. It was a big deal, something we'd both wanted for him. It meant more travel, longer hours, and a new circle of colleagues. At first, I was his biggest cheerleader. But the man who came home from those trips was different. Subtly different. He was like a radio station that was just slightly off the frequency, full of static where there used to be clear music. The easy silence we once shared became a tense, empty space. Our conversations, which used to meander through dreams and ideas, became logistical. Who was picking up the dry cleaning? Had the mail come? He stopped asking about my painting. He stopped asking about my day. And when I would talk, I could feel his attention drifting, his eyes glazing over, already somewhere else. Then came the phone. For 15 years, his phone had been like an extension of the kitchen counter, an open, communal object. Then one day, it started living face down. Always. On the nightstand, on the coffee table, next to the sink. It was a small change, almost insignificant. When I casually asked why, he brushed it off. Just a habit. Don't want the screen to get scratched. But my gut, that primal instinct I had learned to ignore, sent up a tiny, red flag. The flags started multiplying. a new password on the laptop, which he said was a, quote, new security protocol from IT, late nights at the office that became more frequent, explained away with a sigh and a complaint about a demanding new project. He started angling his body away from me when he texted, a barely perceptible shift, but one that felt like a door being quietly closed in my face. Every time I felt that knot of unease in my stomach, I would crush it. I would tell myself I was being ridiculous. This was the man who promised to build a life with me under a canopy of stars. The man who held me in a firelit cabin and made me feel like the center of the universe. I was letting my insecurity get the best of me. I was inventing problems. He would tell me as much, in his calm, reasonable voice. You're overthinking things, he'd say gently, when I'd try to talk about the distance I felt. I'm just tired. Work is crazy right now. And he would look at me with such apparent sincerity that I would end up apologizing. I would apologize for feeling the way I felt. I was the one who was wrong. He was just stressed. I just needed to be a more supportive wife. But the poison of doubt, once it enters the system, does its work. I remember one evening I was so excited to tell him about a small gallery that had shown interest in one of my paintings. It was the first real validation I'd had in years. I waited for him to get home, rehearsing how I would tell him, my heart thrumming with a joy I hadn't felt in a long time. He walked in, dropped his briefcase, and headed straight for the mail. I started to tell him my news, my voice bubbling with excitement. He didn't even look up from the bills. That's nice, he said, his voice flat, distracted. And that was it. He moved on to talking about his day, some frustrating meeting he'd had. My joy just deflated. It shriveled up inside me until it was a small, hard knot of shame. I felt foolish, insignificant. It wasn't cruel in an obvious way. It was the cruelty of indifference. It was the slow, steady message that my world, my passions, my triumphs were no longer important, that I was no longer important. That was the true nature of the cracks. It wasn't about shouting matches. It was about the slow death of being seen. I felt myself becoming invisible in my own home. I was the keeper of the house, the manager of our social life, the backdrop to his increasingly important career. I was a supporting character in the story of his life, and I had forgotten how to be the lead in my own. And then came the night the tide rushed in. The night, all those tiny red flags, all those dismissed gut feelings, all that static in the air coalesced into a single, silent, pulsing blue light. He was asleep beside me, his breathing even and deep, the picture of peaceful innocence. The house was wrapped in that profound quiet that only happens in the deepest part of the night. But inside my chest, a war was raging. A voice of reason, the wife I had been for 2 decades, pleaded with me. Don't look. You're creating a problem where there isn't one. Trust him. Trust the man you built a life with. But another voice, a wilder, rawer one, that I had silenced for years, screamed back. You know. You already know. You have felt it in your bones for months. You have to see it. You have to stop lying to yourself. My hand shook as I reached for the phone. It felt cold and alien in my hand, a piece of technology that held the power to either confirm my deepest fears or validate my sanity. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. I touched the screen. It wasn't locked, it was an invitation. An open door to the truth I had been so terrified to face. And I stepped through it. It wasn't just a message. It was a world. A parallel life I had no idea he was living. The name at the top was unfamiliar, but the words below were intimate, casual, and utterly devastating. Can't wait for next week. Thinking about you. I miss your laugh. And then, I scrolled up, and I saw the pictures. Her smiling into the camera. And then, them, together, at our favorite Italian restaurant, sitting in our usual booth. On a hiking trail he had told me he was exploring for work. His arm was around her, and he was looking at her with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in years. An expression of pure, unguarded joy. He was wearing the gray cashmere sweater I had given him for Christmas. The air didn't just leave my lungs. It was sucked out by a vacuum. The room tilted. The shadows on the wall seemed to writhe and stretch. It wasn't a sharp, sudden pain. It was a cold, spreading numbness that started in my chest and radiated out to the tips of my fingers. I sat on the edge of our bed, the bed we had shared for 20 years, and I scrolled through the evidence of my own oblivion. I went back months, then a year, then 2. It was a detailed chronicle of their life together, woven through the fabric of ours. There were references to me. Dinner with her tonight, I'll call you after. Family thing this weekend. Counting the minutes until I can see you. I was not just a wife, I was an obstacle. An inconvenience. The man sleeping peacefully beside me, the man whose steady presence had been my anchor for my entire adult life, was a complete stranger. A liar. And the woman I was, she was a fool. Every memory we had ever made was now contaminated. Our wedding photo on the dresser seemed to sneer at me. The house we had built, brick by painful brick, was a sham. A stage set for a play where I was the only one who didn't know my lines were part of a tragedy. I sat there in the blue glow of that screen. Until the sky outside began to pale, my world shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. The foundation hadn't just eroded. It had been a mirage all along. The confrontation wasn't the screaming match you see in movies. There was no throwing of plates. No dramatic accusations shouted across a room. It was worse. It was quiet. Devastatingly quiet. I waited until the sun was fully up. Until the smell of brewing coffee filled the kitchen. A routine so normal it felt like a cruel joke. He came downstairs, smiling, and asked if I'd slept well. The question hung in the air between us, so absurd, so completely disconnected from the reality I now inhabited. I just looked at him, my face, a blank mask I had carefully constructed during the long, dark hours of the morning. I slid the phone across the granite countertop. It made a soft, scraping sound that seemed to echo in the silence. The change in his face is something I will never forget. The slow draining of color, the flicker of panic in his eyes, the way his smile dissolved like sugar in water. Then came the denials. The weak, pathetic litany of lies. It's not what you think. She's just a friend. It was a mistake. Each word was an insult to my intelligence, another shovel of dirt on the grave of our marriage. I didn't argue, I didn't scream. I just listened, and with every hollow excuse, a cold, hard clarity settled over me. The final straw wasn't the affair itself. The final straw was him, standing in our sunlit kitchen, looking me in the eye and lying. He wasn't sorry he did it, he was just sorry he got caught. In that moment, I saw that the man I had loved was gone. Maybe he had never really been there at all. I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable, until he started to fidget. Then I took a breath, and the word came out, not with anger, but with the flat finality of a judge's gavel. I want a divorce. He looked stunned, as if I had just started speaking in a foreign language. What? Don't be ridiculous, we can work through this. People have affairs. It doesn't have to be the end. He tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled it back as if from a fire. The end had already happened. We were just living in the wreckage. His shock wasn't for our marriage. It was for the disruption to his comfortable double life. He wasn't fighting for me. He was fighting for his routine. And that was the moment I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that there was nothing left to save. The days that followed were a blur of numb logistics. I walked upstairs, pulled a single suitcase from the top of the closet, and began to pack. Not with rage, but with a strange, surgical detachment. A few clothes. My toothbrush. The worn paperback I was reading. I didn't take the photos. I didn't take the mementos. I was leaving the set, and I couldn't take the props with me. Walking out of that house, the house we had painted and tiled and filled with our dreams, felt like tearing off my own skin. I was leaving behind not just a husband, but an entire future I had meticulously mapped out. The click of the front door locking behind me echoed like a gunshot, the start of a new, terrifying war. Telling people was its own special kind of hell. There were the hushed phone calls, the awkward pauses, friends trying to remain neutral, their allegiances subtly shifting. My mother's tearful plea to try to work it out. His family, who had once called me a daughter, now looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. I became a project, a problem to be solved, a subject of whispered gossip. And through it all, I just had to keep moving, one foot in front of the other, through a world that no longer felt like mine. The divorce process itself was not a battle of screaming lawyers. It was a cold, quiet vivisection of a life. Our separation was technically amicable, which is a sterile word for two people who agree to dismantle their shared history without throwing things. There were no children to fight over, just the assets. And that was almost worse. Our love, our memories, our 20 years were reduced to a spreadsheet. The house we built, the art we collected, the retirement account we planned. Every line item was a ghost of a shared dream. The hardest day was in a mediator's office. A beige, soulless room with a large mahogany table that felt like a coffin between us. We sat across from each other, not making eye contact, as a stranger in a suit talked us through the division of our life. When he got to the cabin in Vermont, the one where we'd been snowed in, the one that held my most sacred memory, I felt the air leave my body. The market value is estimated at... The mediator droned on, and all I could see was the firelight on his face, the look in his eyes that I thought was forever. I had to excuse myself, stumbling into the hallway, gasping for air that wouldn't come, choking on the ashes of that memory. Signing the final papers happened months later, on a gray, drizzly Tuesday. The lawyer slid the thick stack of paper across the desk. My hand trembled as I picked up the pen. It felt impossibly heavy. I looked at the line at the bottom of the page, waiting for my name, the name I had carried for 20 years. As I signed it, I felt three things at once. First, a wave of profound, gut-wrenching sadness for the girl who had said yes in a bookstore, for the woman who had believed in a promise made under the stars. It was the death of a dream, and it deserved to be mourned. Then, a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear. I was 45 years old, completely and utterly alone, with a future that was a terrifying, blank page. But underneath it all, as the ink dried on the paper, there was something else. A tiny, fragile seed of relief. The closing of a door, the end of the lie, the final, irrevocable cut of the cord. In signing away my past, I was, for the first time, claiming my future. It was a terrifying freedom, but it was mine. The first few months after the divorce was finalized were a study in contradiction. The silence in my small apartment was so absolute it felt like a sound in itself, a constant, low hum of absence. I would wake in the night with my heart pounding, reaching for a phantom presence in the empty half of the bed. I had to learn the geography of being alone, the sharp edges of a life built for one. Grief is a strange, shapeless thing. It would ambush me in the produce aisle, seeing a type of apple he liked, or in the car when a song from our first year together would play on the radio. I was mourning a man, yes, but I was also mourning the woman I had been with him, and the future I had been so certain of. But in the midst of that vast, lonely landscape, small, wildflowers of freedom began to bloom. It started with the thermostat. For 20 years, the house was kept at his preferred 68 degrees. The first night I turned it up to a balmy 74, put on my fuzziest socks, and felt no guilt. It was a revelation. I started eating breakfast for dinner. I painted one wall of my living room a deep, unapologetic teal he would have called garish. Each tiny decision, made for me and by me, was an act of reclamation. It was terrifying, and it was exhilarating. I knew I couldn't navigate this new world alone. I found a therapist, a kind woman with wise eyes who didn't let me wallow. She helped me see that my identity hadn't been erased. It had just been buried. Our sessions were archaeological digs, gently brushing the dust off the person I was before I became a we, and I started painting again. At first, my hands felt clumsy, the muscle memory gone. But I persisted. I filled canvases not with pretty landscapes, but with the chaos inside me. Slashes of angry red, deep pools of grieving blue, and eventually, tentative strokes of hopeful yellow. My art became my translator, speaking the language of my healing when I had no words. I reconnected with the friends I had let drift, the ones who knew me when my name was still my own. They didn't offer pity. They offered pizza and wine and late-night conversations that reminded me of who I was at my core. Today, my life looks nothing like the one I had planned, and I am so profoundly grateful for that. I live in a small apartment in a part of the city I chose, filled with mismatched furniture, thriving plants, and canvases leaning against every wall. My mornings begin not with an alarm clock, but with the sun. I drink my expensive coffee, the kind he called a waste of money, and I watch the world wake up. My days are structured around my painting, which has, miraculously, become more than a hobby. It's my work, my passion, my purpose. I sold my first piece 6 months ago, and I cried. Not because of the money, but because a stranger saw a piece of my soul and wanted to take it home. I've learned that I am far more resilient than I ever gave myself credit for. The quiet, accommodating woman who was afraid to make waves? She is still a part of me, but she no longer runs the show. I've discovered a strength in my own stillness. I learned that true love doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller. It doesn't thrive in secrets or silence. A real partnership is two whole people choosing to walk side by side, not one person living in the shadow of the other. People often ask if I've forgiven him. It's a complicated question. Forgiveness for me isn't about absolving him of his choices. He is who he is. My forgiveness is for me. I forgive myself for not seeing what was right in front of me. I forgive myself for believing in a story that wasn't true. I've released the anger, not because he deserves it, but because I deserve to live without that poison in my veins. It's like putting down a heavy bag I didn't even realize I was carrying. The past is a place of reference, not a place of residence. As for the future, I don't look at it as a blank page to be filled anymore. I see it as an open road. I'm not searching for someone to ride shotgun. My life is full. It's rich with friendships and art, and the freedom to book a last-minute flight to see the ocean, just because I feel like it. Am I open to love again? Yes, but the criteria have changed. I'm not looking for an anchor to hold me down. I'm my own anchor now. If love finds me, it will be with someone who knows how to sail, someone who wants to explore the horizon with me, not for me. But if it doesn't, that's okay too. Because the greatest love story I've discovered is the one I'm writing with myself, every single day. The house built on sand was swept away, and in its place, I learned to build a home inside myself. And this foundation is solid rock. If I could reach back through time, back to that dark, silent bedroom, what would I say to the woman I was? To the woman sitting on the edge of that bed, with the phone in her hand and the world crumbling at her feet. First, I would tell her to breathe. Just breathe. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Because in a moment, the air is going to be stolen from you, and you will forget how. I would tell her that the crushing weight she feels on her chest is not her failure. It is the weight of a lie she did not create. I would whisper to her, "You are not a fool. You are a woman who loved with her whole heart. You are a woman who built a home on a promise, who trusted with a fierce and beautiful loyalty. Do not ever let this moment convince you that your capacity to love was a weakness. It was, and it remains, your greatest strength." I would tell her that the path ahead is going to be a desert. There will be days so dry, so empty, you will believe you cannot possibly take another step. Let yourself fall. Let yourself lie in the sand and weep. Grieve for the life you are losing. Grieve for the man you thought you knew. But know this: every tear that falls is watering a seed that is buried deep inside you. A seed of a woman you haven't even met yet. And she is a warrior. She is an artist. She is a survivor. The strength you think is gone is just dormant, waiting for the storm to pass so it can grow towards the sun. You are not breaking. You are breaking open. And if you are sitting in that darkness right now, if my story sounds like an echo of your own, I want to speak directly to you. If you are on the floor of your bathroom, or in a sterile lawyer's office, or staring at an empty space in your bed, please hear me. Your life is not over. The story you were writing has ended, but you are still the author. You get to turn the page. Your worth was never, ever dependent on their love. It was not something they gave you, and it is not something they can take away. It is the bedrock of who you are. The most important journey you will ever take is not to find new love, but to find your way back to yourself, to learn your own rhythms, to listen to your own voice, to fall in love with the person you are when no one else is looking. The rebuilding is not glamorous. It happens in tiny, sacred moments. It's buying the expensive coffee. It's the first time you laugh so hard you cry. It's booking a trip for one. It's painting a wall, a color only you love. Each small act of choosing yourself is a brick you are laying for a new foundation. And this one will be unbreakable. Your happy ending may not look like the ones in the movies. It might be quieter, but it will be real. It will be the profound peace of waking up in the morning, in a life you designed, and feeling whole, all by yourself. The betrayal, the heartbreak, it was the fire that burned the old house down. But you must remember this. You were never the house. You were the queen who lived inside. And from these ashes, you will rise.